Hello again and welcome back to our course on Project 2019. In this section, we're going to start looking at tracking progress on a project. We're going to use the wedding plan again, and I'm looking at version 13 now. We've saved a baseline and I'm pretty happy with the plan. But the first thing I want to do is to take a look at project information now. So let's click on the project information button on the project tab. Now, if you go into project information and click on the statistics button, what you can see now in the lower half of that dialog is that we have current figures for duration, work, and cost. We have baseline figures, which of course currently agree with those current figures, and then we have actual figures that are currently empty. And finally, we have remaining figures, which also agree with the baseline and the current figures. This is the situation that you'll always be in just as you start to record progress on a project. You've saved the baseline, but you've still got everything to do, so that's the remaining. And you haven't actually done anything at all yet. The actuals are all zero. So what happens when you track progress is that you basically start to record actuals. And as the actuals increase, in theory, the remaining should decrease. And hopefully when you get to the end of your project, your remaining will be zero and your actuals will pretty much agree with what was in your baseline. Now, of course, if they agree accurately, that would be an extremely well-planned and executed project indeed. But really, it's your intention to keep it as close to that as you possibly can. Now, the other thing to notice in the top half of the same dialogue is that you've basically got the first three lines the same. So the current start date for the project is Friday, March the 1st, 2019, and the finish is Thursday, November the 21st, 2019. And it's the same for the baseline. We have no actual start information, and we certainly don't have an actual finish as yet. And the variants indicate how much away from the baseline we are. Now let me close this statistics dialogue. And let's go back to project information, because the next thing we need to look at are the top right-hand two fields, current date and status date on the project. Now, hopefully you won't be too surprised to learn that current date is supposed to be the current date, and this is being recorded on Tuesday, March the 19th, 2019. If I want to change that date, I could, and I could use the drop down to do that and make a selection from the date picker. And particularly when I'm recording training material, it's really useful to be able to change the current date, because I can pretend that it's any date that I like when it comes to recording the information in project. I'm actually going to leave that date as it is for the moment. And one thing you'll notice is, of course, that the current date is sometime after when the project actually was planned to start. And you'll realize by now that there's actually quite a cunning reason for that, because I'm able to look back at the first part of the project without lying to you about the current date, and we can look at what's happened for the first couple of months of this project. And of course, again, one very important point here is, of course, that your dates are going to be different to mine. So I'm going to talk about things like choosing a date about a month after the start and choosing a date a couple of months after the start, rather than looking at very specific dates. Of course, you could cheat the dates if you wanted to and use the same dates as me. The second date we're interested in here is the status date. Now, if you work on a project, almost without exception, you'll be recording the status of a project on a date other than when the status was actually recorded. Let me give you an example. A lot of the projects that I work on are IT or training related projects. Many of them are financial services related projects. And very often what we're dealing with is information that's been gathered either from project teams, managers, individuals, and typically it would be something along these lines. What was the status of your project last Wednesday? And by the time we come to put all of that information into Microsoft Project, it's usually a few days old. Now, there are exceptions to that. Sometimes the information goes straight in. In fact, if you use some of the other project-related tools, you can even get members of the team to enter their own status and record their own actuals. But usually what happens is you gather information up to the status date, which may be a Wednesday, a Friday, the end of the month. but you'll often enter it in on a later date. So when we're recording status, when we're recording progress on a project, it's very important that you set the status date, because what you're basically saying to Project 2019 is the information I'm giving you now relates to this status date. And for this instance, the first update that we're going to do is for a status date on, say, the 11th of March. So let's click on OK. And if you look at the Project tab and in the Status group, you'll see the latest status date just there. So you can see it says March the 11th, 2019, which is the date that we just set. Now we're going to do an update of the project. So we use the Update Project button in that Status group. And the Update Project button will give us a couple of options. Now, first of all, we can either say, I want to update the work as complete through, and that means up to this date, so March the 11th, 2019. And I can do one of the following. I can set it to 0 to 100% complete. And what this means is that project will look at a task and say, on this date, how much of it should have been done? Now, for tasks that are way off in the future, the answer will be 0%. For tasks that should have been finished, it will be 100%. And for something that's supposed to be halfway through, it's 50% and so on. Now, project will work that out for you and mark those tasks as being complete by the appropriate percentage. Instead, you can say set 0% or 100% complete only. And what this does is it says if a task isn't due to have started, we consider it to be 0%. If it has been started but it hasn't finished, it's still 0%. It's only when it gets finished, when it's past its finish date, that it will say 100%. Now, sometimes that's a very useful way of doing things where typically you're working with a lot of very small tasks and maybe you're not particularly interested in the percent complete of those many small tasks. But we're going to use the first option here on this occasion. Now we have another option just here, reschedule uncompleted work to start after, and then we could choose a date. And I'm going to talk to you about this a little bit later on, so let's just ignore that for the moment. And then we'll make a choice. We say, do we want to update this for the entire project or for selected tasks? Now for the first update or two, I'm going to update the whole project. So let's click on OK to run the update. Now, in fact, if I scroll up and down the project, you'll see that there are only 2 tasks due to have anything happen at all there. And the first of them was agree, budget and approach. Now, it was due to start on Friday, March the 1st, 2019, and finish on Thursday, March the 14th, 2019. Therefore, it should have finished by the date that I set, my status date, which in fact it has. And you can see I have a nice tick in the first column just there. The other task that's due to have started is this one, make guest list. Now let's just open up the task information and have a quick look at something about that task. Because if we now look at its percentage complete, it's now got a percentage complete figure of 7%. And that's important because project has made that calculation for us based on the duration of the task. Now, a very important point. Sometimes you'll update a project in the way that we've done here, and you'll look at the whole thing and say, yep, it's all going to schedule, and project will automatically calculate all those percent completes for you. But in other situations, you may actually need to go through every single task and indicate for each individual task what its percentage complete was. Now that can be quite a laborious task, but it's often a very important one. Now, once you start recording progress, there are some very good visual and other indicators of how things are going on. Let's stick with the Gantt chart for just a moment. And if you look back at task ID number 2, the one that's ticked, the complete one, note that the Gantt chart bar has a horizontal line, a dark line through the middle of it. That indicates that it is in fact complete. Whereas if you look down at task 18, make guest list, we know that that's 7% complete, and note how it has a very tiny dark line in there, which just indicates we're only a small proportion of the way through the task. The other thing I want to do now is to change the table that we're looking at. So I'm going to go to the View tab. I'm going to go to Tables, and I'm going to apply the tracking table. Now, having applied that, I do need to adjust these columns a little bit to make them a little bit easier to see and to read. So let's drag that over. And I think that will do. Now in the tracking table, you can see that we now have some actuals. For instance, we have an actual start for agree, budget and approach. And in absence of any other information, it's currently Friday, March the 1st, 2019. We also have an actual finish, and again, in absence of any other information, it's currently Thursday, March the 14th, 2019. When we did that project update, because we didn't tell project anything else other than the fact that all of the tasks were running to schedule, project will deduce that the task must have finished when it was scheduled to finish, which in fact was March the 14th. Now also notice that the task has a percentage complete of 100%. Its actual duration was 10 days. The remaining duration is 0. And the actual work 160 hours. Bear in mind that 2 people were working on that for 8 hours a day for 10 hours, so that's 160. Of course, the bride and the groom aren't charging their time, so there's no actual cost involved. If you go down to Make Guest List, Task ID 18, in this case we have an actual start, which is Friday, March the 15th, 2019, but no actual finish because the task hasn't finished yet. We have a percentage complete of 7%. We have an actual duration of 1 day and a remaining duration of 14 days. And the other important point here, if you take Make Guest List as an example, Make Guest List is actually part of a summary task. And the fact that we've done 7% of that task means that we've done 2% of the entire guest's task. And you can see there 2% complete. So that's our first bit of progress tracking. And we're going to do another bit in the next section. But just before we finish this section, just up to the Project tab again and click on Project Information. And let's jump back into Statistics. And of course, now we have some actuals listed in our statistics. So for instance, if you look in the lower half there, we've got 176 hours of work. So some of these actual figures are now completed. And you can see there the percentage complete, duration 2%, work 8%. And also note in the top half that we now have an actual start date, but of course currently no finish date. So that's it for this section. Please join me in the next one.